Hello, and welcome to my next video in the Fantasy Grounds tutorial series. In this video, I will go over the launcher screen, explain the various changes and options now available to you as a DM and as a player, as well as explain what the various settings mean. Finally, I will show you what the update process looks like so that you can be more familiar with all aspects of the launcher screen in general and feel more comfortable with it. So with that in mind, let's get started. Now that we have the details of what Fantasy Grounds is, I can begin the process of explaining how to use Fantasy Grounds. And it's a very complicated piece of software, but hopefully my videos will be able to allow you to flatten the learning curve a little bit and get you up and running with the game fairly quickly. So as you can see on my screen, I currently have two different versions of Fantasy Grounds running. You can tell by their appearance. The one on the right is called Fantasy Grounds Classic, and the reason it is being called the Fantasy Grounds Classic version is it is the current version. This is the one that a lot of DMs and players are still using, and it will be supported for quite a while yet, as far as we've been able to determine from Smiteworks. Whereas the one on the left, that is the new version. That is being called the Fantasy Grounds Unity Edition, and it is being called that because Smiteworks went through and replaced the underlying engine to the Unity graphics engine to allow them to deal with a few technical issues that they were running into with the older version. One of the technical issues that they were looking to resolve is the ability to do line of sight as part of the maps. And with the Unity edition, that functionality is there, and I will be doing a video at some point that goes through and shows you how to make use of it, as well as doing another video that shows you how to go through and set it up. Whereas the Classic Edition did not have that functionality, and based on previous communication from Smiteworks, is not able to have that capability due to the underlying engine that they're using. So this video is actually a re-recording of a video that I had already done explaining the launcher functionality. But because Fantasy Grounds Unity is still going through an early access release cycle, having just come out of private beta into an open beta, some changes have actually already occurred because of this. One of them being that they've restructured the launch screen once again. So one of those changes is that the load campaign and create campaign buttons have reemerged onto the launcher screen, and the join campaign has been shifted down to the middle portion of the left side of that particular screen. Whereas prior, the join campaign had been up near the top of where load campaign was. Actually, it was in the position where create campaign was, and there was a host campaign option that had merged the functionality of load and create into one button, and then you did that. You either created a campaign or loaded a campaign from that same screen. That doesn't exist anymore. This is what the current version of the launcher actually looks like. In addition to that, we have a couple of new buttons that have appeared on the middle part of the screen, or the main portion of the screen, if you will. Where watch videos used to be is now a button called Game Systems. The buttons in the middle under Getting Content have had their wording shortened, such as FG Web Store is what used to be there. It is now just simply Web Store, and FG Steam Store is now just simply Steam Store. And under the Getting Help section, we have a fourth button that is actually called Discord. So that takes you right to the Discord server. And the email support option has been readjusted. Finally, release notes has been moved from the top down to the bottom, and the quick start guide button is now new on this particular screen. So they have balanced out the screen a lot in a much better way and provided you different options here that actually seem to make a little bit more sense as to what used to be there. So each of these buttons will actually do slightly different things. User Manual, Basic Guides, and Game Systems will take you to the Fantasy Grounds Unity-specific wiki and take you directly to the appropriate subcategory that you're clicking on there. So Game Systems, for example, will take you to a page that shows you all of the available rule sets, while Basic Guides and User Manual will take you to different links within that particular wiki. The Quick Start Guide will actually take you to an intro video that Smiteworks itself has done in preparation for the launch of Fantasy Grounds Unity going forward. Web Store takes you directly to Smiteworks' own Fantasy Grounds web store, whereas the Steam Store will take you to the Fantasy Grounds Steam store page currently within Steam. I do not know if it is the Fantasy Grounds Unity specific version or the classic version. I didn't actually take that close of a look for it. I do believe Smiteworks might still be working on getting a Fantasy Grounds Unity specific capability within Steam, but I don't know how that's progressing. Forums takes you right to the Fantasy Grounds forums, and Discord takes you to a Discord reference page that actually shows you different channels within Discord. I'm not sure if you can interact with it or not, but it doesn't actually load the Discord app. It loads a website that's specific to the Fantasy Grounds Discord functionality, and looks like it can show you what's there. The FAQ takes you to the current FAQ page, and email support just simply allows you to email support in the event that you have issues. Release notes is the only confusing one that I find here because it currently takes you to the Classic Edition release notes, not those specific to Unity. So if you want to get to the release notes specific to Unity, you have to go to forums and then look for the Fantasy Grounds Unity playtest forum in order to be able to see the results that are there. The buttons on the left still show you or still function like they do for the Classic Edition. So load campaign, create campaign allow you to load and or create a campaign. Join campaign allows players to join a campaign that is up and running. Settings allows you to adjust your login credentials used for Fantasy Grounds and Paizo, and allow you to be able to link your Steam account and your Paizo account into your Fantasy Grounds account so that you can download or access or gain any benefit in the event of Paizo because of that. And in the event of Steam and the Fantasy Grounds web store, it's what Fantasy Grounds will use to pull down any DLC that you have purchased, as well as to validate your license. And then check for updates is obviously the check for updates functionality. That all has not really changed from within Fantasy Grounds Classic, although the screen itself has been reorganized to modernize the actual screen. So back to the differences between the Classic Edition and the Fantasy Grounds Unity Edition of the launcher screen here. There are some things that I need to point out. One is the main graphic change that has occurred. You'll see that this is a much brighter graphic that was used previously. This folder option in the upper right of the graphic has now been moved to the upper left portion of the entire Fantasy Grounds screen itself. And that is right next to the debug console that is currently accessible within Fantasy Grounds. Your username is now in the lower left portion of the Fantasy Grounds banner here, and they have changed the structure of the version information that you used to see in reference to Fantasy Grounds here. Now, if you look, you'll see that on the Classic Edition it says version 3.3.10 Ultimate, whereas here it says version 4.0.0 Ultimate and then a date. So there is a bit of a difference there. And then other than the fact that these buttons are now stacked on top of each other here, the start button is still the same. There really hasn't been much more in the way of changes that have occurred. The final change that I will point out is that in the Classic Edition, you used to be able to manage your characters clicking on this option here. That doesn't happen here in the Unity Edition. In fact, you need to have Fantasy Grounds up and running fully loaded before you can actually even access your characters at this point. There is no manage character functionality. Now, whether that gets added later on, I haven't seen any information about that at the time of this particular recording, so I wouldn't count on that functionality returning. So the last thing I want to cover is, now that you've seen the differences on what actually shows up here, there's one last difference that is not immediately visible, and that's because I've already updated both of my versions of Fantasy Grounds, one for a game that I had already hosted last night, and this morning when I was looking over some information in preparation for this video for the Unity Edition. This check for updates button on the Classic Edition will actually be red. The whole button will be red, except for the text. And that will tell you right off that there is an update pending for your particular version of Fantasy Grounds. In relation to the Unity Edition, there will be a red box that wraps around the check for updates wording on this particular button. It doesn't go outside of the bounds of the button, but it highlights that particular button has a red border around it. And that tells you for your Unity edition that there are outstanding updates ready to be deployed to your system. And there'll be two main scenarios where you will actually get an updates indicator. The first one is whether SmiteWorks has released an actual update for the version of Fantasy Grounds that you're running. So you'll note that I'm running 2020-04-17. Well, if they release an update on 2020-04-30, and that's the next update that goes out, then when I log in May or start up Fantasy Grounds in May, I will see a highlight option there that tells me that the new version has been released. The second time or condition, if you will, where you will see an actual update indicator is if you've recently purchased DLC. And DLC can be tokens, it could be a module, such as like a player's handbook or a supplement guide for 5th edition. It could be a new rule set, so maybe you bought the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule sets and some of its supplements, or Cypher or Starfinder or Pathfinder or anything along those lines. When you make a purchase, whether it's from the web store direct from Fantasy Grounds or through Steam, then you will have the way that it works is that Fantasy Grounds' own servers will receive a notification that you have made that particular purchase, as long as your accounts are linked between Steam and Fantasy Grounds, as well as between Paizo and Fantasy Grounds. And then the next time you start up Fantasy Grounds, it will be ready for you to pull down. Now, generally, there's a little bit of lag time. I've been able to do it in as little as 5 minutes before the updates are shown as being available. Sometimes it does take a little longer. It really depends on how frequently they sync, as well as how busy they are in relation to syncing things. So I've noticed that during a sale, it can take a little bit longer for that information to sync over, but generally not by much. It's like a couple of minutes. So those are really the two times that you will see an indication there that it is right. Your version of Fantasy Grounds is ready for an update. So now that I've gone through the process of showing you what the launcher screen looks like between the two different versions of Fantasy Grounds, I'll now go through the process of showing you how to configure your settings, as well as what things look like when you're going through the process of executing an update. Before we actually get into the settings screen, I just want to point out something that a DM who potentially runs multiple instances of Fantasy Grounds might encounter in the event that they're running two windows of the same version of Fantasy Grounds, or one window for the Unity edition versus one window for the Classic edition, which is what I've got running here in this case. So when you run or click on the settings button or the check for updates button, you will get this particular screen or something very similar to this. And you won't be able to go through the process of actually completing that update until you have closed the other window. Once you've done that, you'll be able to get into the settings screen. So once you're able to get the settings screen open, you'll be taken to this very first tab called Basic. And what that means is it's your basic settings associated with Fantasy Grounds itself. In relation to the FGEU application UI scale, that changes the size of the font in the windows, and the smaller the value, the more you can fit on the screen. So if you run with very tight real estate on your screen, you might want a smaller UI scale, although it will make some of the information a little bit harder to read. If you have vision issues, then you'll probably want to increase the scale so that the font and the images are larger, and it'll be a little bit easier to read, and you won't necessarily have to use some of the built-in magnification functionality that might be available through some of the accessibility tools of your operating system. The license key is going to be associated with a couple of things. It could be associated with a demo edition if you're just trying it out. I'm not entirely certain if it populates that particular field with a generic demo key or whether you're sent one. It's been a long time, about 3 years since I last looked at that, so I flat out forgotten whether that actually is a thing or not. But in relation to a standard license key or standard subscription license key, you would put that key in there. And if you have purchased the Ultimate Edition or the Ultimate Subscription, you will receive a license key that you will put in that same field. So the license key you enter there will tell Fantasy Grounds what edition you are going to be running. And there are different keys between Fantasy Grounds Unity and Fantasy Grounds Classic. You cannot take a license key from Fantasy Grounds Classic and make use of it in Fantasy Grounds Unity, and you can't do the opposite. You can't take a key that is specific to Unity and make use of it in Fantasy Grounds Classic, I do not believe. Next, your username and your password. These are associated with your Fantasy Grounds account. It is not associated with Steam. It is not associated with Paizo or any other partner that Smiteworks later adds to these particular screens. It is literally specific to your Fantasy Grounds account. And the reason for that is it is used to tell Fantasy Grounds what packages you are entitled to. So when you load up Fantasy Grounds, the software will communicate back to Fantasy Grounds' own licensing servers, if you will, and will be told what DLCs you own, whether there are any updates associated with any of those DLCs, what edition of Fantasy Grounds you are running, and whether there's any associated updates with that version of Fantasy Grounds, as well as tokens, modules, things like that. Anything that you have purchased, whether it's through the Paizo store or through the Steam store or Fantasy Grounds website. Although I think with Paizo, you make a purchase there, you gain a it links through a savings on a particular package through the Smiteworks store. I don't believe it's that you actually purchase a module from Paizo. I've never run a Pathfinder campaign, so I honestly don't know, or a Starfinder campaign, so I honestly don't know 100% how that actually works, but I think you're entitled to a discount. I don't think it's that it links a module back to Fantasy Grounds. So that's where this account comes into play. If you load up Fantasy Grounds and that account field is empty, it has no way to know whether you're running a legitimate edition of Fantasy Grounds. Therefore, it doesn't work. And that's one of the reasons why you have to be careful with those particular credentials. The other thing, the username is going to be the same username that shows up in the upper left version of the launcher screen. So it's the lower portion of the Fantasy Grounds banner, lower left, but upper portion of the whole launcher screen. And if you are a player, that is the username that will show up on the DM side when you connect. So you would literally have to log in with an entirely different username for you to change the username now in the Unity edition, whereas with the Classic edition, you could change your username almost at will when it came to how you connected to a particular DM system. So when you click on the Account tab, you will be given the option to link your Steam account or your Paizo account, I don't exactly know how to pronounce that, but anyway, into your Fantasy Grounds account. And what that creates the link that allows Fantasy Grounds to see if you have purchased any DLC through Steam, or if you were entitled to discounts when you make a purchase through the Paizo store, in the sense of Pathfinder modules, or I think Starfinder, I think is one of the other things that they do. I'm not entirely certain of any other modules that they do. I don't know them that well. And that's what allows Fantasy Grounds to determine whether there's any modules that need to be pulled down to your system. So the Advanced tab is the last of the tabs that exists. And in this particular case, it shows you where Fantasy Grounds is physically installed versus where your campaign data, your Fantasy Grounds resources, whatever you want to call them, is going to be stored when you go through and create a campaign, or when you go through and connect to a DM's server and some of the content is cached locally to your system, it'll get stored in the data directory. The application directory is physically where Fantasy Grounds is running out of. And it is not associated with your profile. It's typically where you feel the most comfortable installing Fantasy Grounds or installing application software on your system. The data directory is typically within your roaming profile, but you can put that anywhere you want. And in my case, for example, I have that in my documents folder on my Windows system, whereas my Unity version is currently just running out of my roaming profile. So there is a bit of a difference in location there, and that's how I keep my two versions of Fantasy Grounds separate. Advanced logging increases the amount of logging that Fantasy Grounds will do on the off chance that you're running into a particular issue and Fantasy Grounds, or Smiteworks rather, is asking for more information. They'll probably ask you to turn on the advanced logging functionality, and that will start populating various logs that'll show up in your, I think it's your data directories where it gets dropped. It may actually be under the app directory, but the log files that I've seen are generally under the data directory. The build channel that is here is generally going to be specific to the version you're most comfortable with running. So live, 99% of the players out there are going to be running with the live version of Fantasy Grounds, both the DMs and the players. Whereas test might be an upcoming version of Fantasy Grounds that Smiteworks has asked people to test associated with the edition. So, and what I mean by that is that Fantasy Grounds Classic has its own set of build channels, whereas Fantasy Grounds Unity has a set of build channels associated for that edition. Dev, there's a good chance you are most likely not going to be running that unless you're doing actual development work for like a module or an extension of some kind, or you actually work with Smiteworks and are doing development that way. And previous, I'm not entirely certain if that refers to the previous edition as in the classic edition of Fantasy Grounds, or if it means that you want to downgrade the version that you have updated. I think that particular thing is new. I don't recall seeing that there. Although, to be honest, I haven't really looked at build channel because I generally run with the live edition. I don't generally run with any other edition. In fact, I don't think I've ever switched since I bought the demo version or tried the demo version. And then lastly, something that you may not have noticed is that on all three screens, there has been this red uninstall button that has been very visible. And that essentially will trigger an uninstallation of your Fantasy Grounds application, and it should leave your data directory intact. It should not remove anything out of this data directory unless it is specific to your license key, for example. For the most part, it will just simply empty out to the app directory. That way, you can, let's say, as a student, you might not necessarily have the time to go through and run a session or play in a session all the time, but you also don't want to pay for it all the time, so you go with the subscription option. And that allows you to temporarily suspend your subscription and then reinstall it later and still have the data that you left there. And that's the reason why that is there. And then obviously there's the cancel and the save options here that allow you to either cancel all the changes that you've just made or save to actually save the changes that you've made. These buttons, I do believe, are context specific. So if you switch back to account or basic, they would be specific to that. So if I made a change here and I switched from advanced to account, you will get a prompt stating, do you wish to save your changes before you move to the next screen? So that's what that option means there. Once you have completed the entry for your account information for your Fantasy Grounds account, at that point you will now be ready to go through the process of running your first update to be able to pull down all of the most recent content and or DLC that you have purchased. So once you have made the save and you exit out of that settings screen, you will be dropped into the updater screen. And you'll see that there are a couple of options. There's the log option here, which will just simply take you to your logs directory. You can go back into your settings screen. You could launch Fantasy Grounds if there are no updates pending, or you can actually go through the process of running through and executing an update, which is what I'm going to do here. And the way this works is it will communicate with Fantasy Grounds' data servers and check to see if any package that you have installed it has an update outstanding. In addition to that, it will check to make sure that the launcher itself doesn't have an update out there. Once it's dealt with the launcher, it will check to see if Fantasy Grounds has any outstanding updates. And once it has done Fantasy Grounds, it will begin to go through the process of pulling down any and all DLC that you have not yet installed. Or if you've already gone through and installed it, it will go through and check to see if there's any outstanding updates. And then once that is complete, you are ready to launch Fantasy Grounds. Yep, and that has launched on another screen. And now we're back to the screen that we were at. Now I've closed out the Classic Edition because from this point forward, I will be dealing strictly with the Unity version of Fantasy Grounds. I will no longer be dealing with anything specific to the Classic Edition, although I might periodically point out that this is how it used to work in the Classic Edition. This is how it now works in relation to Unity. So now that you've either gone through the process of registering your version of Fantasy Grounds and going and getting everything updated, or just simply updating the edition of Fantasy Grounds that you were running for those that are just simply running a demo version. As a player, you are now ready to go through the process of joining a DM session and carrying on with a game that you may have already had going, or that the DM is literally just starting up. In relation to the DM side of things, if you have not yet created a campaign, you'll want to go through the process of clicking on that Create Campaign button. And if you have already got an existing campaign that you have brought over to Unity, then you just simply click on the Load Campaign and go through and load your campaign. I highly recommend you don't do that yet. Fantasy Grounds is still in early access, and there might still be bugs that could potentially corrupt that campaign, and you would not be able to use that campaign again on the Classic Edition. So this concludes the introduction to the new Fantasy Grounds Unity launcher screen. And I hope you found this particular video useful, made things a little bit easier for you, explained a few things that you weren't necessarily overly clear on. And I hope that I will see you in the next series of videos. I wish to thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. I hope you found it informative and useful to familiarizing yourself with Fantasy Grounds in general, and that you had fun in the process. If you found the video useful and you liked the content of the particular video, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions specific to the topic covered by this particular video, or just have some comments in general, please feel free to post something in the comments section, and I will do my best to respond to any questions that are asked. Additionally, I do release content quite regularly, and it's generally specific to Fantasy Grounds or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons at this time. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe and click the notification bell to ensure that notification is sent to you when I release a new video.